The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents Arguments from Wind and Love. Throughout the course of this project, I'm going to hopefully continue to present arguments that I hear, and not just formal arguments, not just arguments with classical formations and names, things like the teleological arguments or the ontological arguments, because quite frankly, as I mentioned in a talk I recently gave at RecentCon, most of the people you're going to interact with who are believers don't know these arguments. Many of them can't thoroughly explain or accurately explain what it is that they believe, let alone why. They're not necessarily familiar with the formal arguments, and that's fine. If you have a good reason to believe, it doesn't matter whether that good reason is encapsulated in a named classical formal argument. The problem is that I don't see any good reasons. So after the debate at Austin Peay University, outside of Nashville, a young woman came up to me and asked, "Do you believe in wind?" Having heard arguments like this before, I had a pretty good idea what was coming. But it also struck me that this is exactly the sort of conversation that I wish had been recorded so that people could see and benefit from what was said. So I'm going to relay sort of what happened and talk about how this argument ad ventum, if we wanted to give it a fancy name, the argument from wind, is horribly flawed and very similar to other arguments that we've heard as well. So when she asked me, "Do you believe in wind?" I of course said yes. I mean, it's the sort of thing where it depends on how you label it. I mean, it's not like wind is a thing that exists unto itself. So I immediately pointed out that, don't you mean air? You know, I mean, this is the classical, or I guess not a classical, this is a version of the argument is, do you believe in air? Well, you can't see it. And she wanted to stick with wind, and I was fine with that. And then I said, of course I believe in wind. It's air moving. But what's the question here? Well, you can't see wind. Well, that's pretty correct. I mean, I can see the effects of wind. And I knew that this was the answer that she was looking for, and I could see her face light up with a big smile, because as soon as I said I can see the effects of wind, she immediately went to yes, and that's exactly like God, because I can't see God, but I can see the effects of God. This is a problem because it intuitively feels like somebody has actually justified something. It feels like I'm now walking down the path of argumentation that they were expecting. What she didn't expect was for me to point out that we can measure wind, and that the effects of wind that I observe and label as wind, you know, a breeze rustling the leaves, etc., is something that I can point out to others, and they can independently verify this. So this is not identical to her claim that she sees the effects of God. In fact, what it seems to be is that she sees things and then attributes them to a God, and then uses that attribution as a justification to believe in God. I don't see the winds moving, the leaves moving, attribute it to the wind, and use that as a justification to believe in the wind. It is simply air moving, which is measurable, it's independently verifiable, and the effects are independently observable as well. And we're pretty good at that. We're pretty good at figuring out what the wind speed is and when it's going to cause a tornado. This essentially comes down to you can't see it, and yet you have a justification for believing that it exists. And this is the way our conversation went, was that you can't see it, but you can see the effects of it. And I said, there's all sorts of things that you can't see, and perhaps you can see the effects of them. I mean, I can't observe an atom with the naked eye, and yet we understand that atoms are the building blocks of everything. But not being able to see something doesn't mean that something else that you can't see is real. If it were, then I would be able to justify my belief in invisible pink unicorns by saying, well, you know, you believe in things like wind that you can't see, therefore I'm justified in believing this other thing that I can't see. It completely ignores the process by which we've come to a reasonable understanding and what we're doing and what we're labeling a process, an observed phenomenon by, and how we should go about judging claims that there are gods. This conversation, which went off down a wild path where we talked about slavery and what the Bible's position is, and a number of different topics, began with this idea that because there's something that you can't see, yet believe, that therefore you're justified in believing other things that you can't see, which is simply fallacious. This isn't the only version of this particular line of argument that we're presented with. In the exact same week, before I left to go to Nashville to the university for the debate, somebody on Twitter asked me essentially, can you prove love? There's so many problems with can you prove love? First of all, I like to encourage people to use the word prove in its mathematical sense, that it is a deductive sort of thing and shouldn't be used, at least not as often, in the colloquial sense of can you reasonably demonstrate the truth of this proposition? Can you, by inference and induction even, establish the sort of evidence you would need to justify? So really what they're asking, can you prove love, or can you prove your spouse loves you, or any of these types of things, is we all recognize something that we label as love, and yet it's not a thing that we can touch. It's not a thing that we can see. And they're using the same sort of argument of, we have good reason to believe this despite our inability to see it. Therefore, this other thing that you want to claim there's no good reason to believe, I have good reason even though you can't see it. The problem with love is that love is a label that we put on a complex collection of human emotions and interactions, and beyond humans as well. I have a cat that I'm sure is absolutely in love with me, or at least that's what my wife says. What goes on in that cat's mind? Is it love? Is it love in the way we would recognize it? It certainly seems to be something akin to that. The truth is, there's all different types of interactions that get this love label. We have a parent's love for their child. We are so good at recognizing this that we can tell without sticking somebody under an MRI or finding some way to put love in a test tube. We can tell when a mother is not properly bonding with her child, where postpartum depression or something, the connection, the love connection has not been made. So not only do we have a parent's love for the child, the love that a child experiences for their parent is of a different nature. We have the love between friends that is platonic and non-sexual. We have the sort of sexual attraction that we call love that may or may not be the basis for a foundation of a relationship between two people, but may just be about sexual attraction. And we can call that love. We can call the love that people, a bonded pair of significant others, feels and expresses love. And we can identify, we can say, these are the sort of actions which are generally consistent with what one would do if somebody loves someone else. What we can't do is absolutely confirm it, but we can't absolutely confirm anything. I'm not absolutely sure about anything. I don't see any path to absolute certainty. But in this world that I engage in, there's a certain set of actions that we recognize as loving actions, going out of your way to help someone, smiling. But it gets better than that, because many of these things, many of these interpersonal connections have physiological responses. Your blood pressure goes up a little bit, your face might flush, and we can in fact stick people under an MRI and process what the brain's doing at different times, and kind of come up with not necessarily a way to quantify and stick love into a beaker, but a way to identify whether or not somebody might be faking love. And the more we learn about the brain, the closer we get to being able to do this with regularity. Now, some might argue that this issue with love is akin to the Supreme Court's decision or definition of pornography, where we can't really define it, but we know it when we see it. And then object and say, are you really sure that you can in fact know it when you see it? But at the end of the day, when we're talking about love, we are talking about things that we recognize as interactions between minds that tell you something about how one mind feels with respect to another mind or something else. You can have something that you label as love for food or cinema or art. I love going for walks. We use this word so much that we may, even on occasion, detract from its meaning. We may use it sarcastically. But at the end of the day, if we're very specific about what we're talking about, how do you know that your spouse loves you? Well, I can't be absolutely certain that my spouse loves me, but what I can do is talk about what sort of expectations I have about those interactions that I would label love, and whether or not my spouse meets them. She does. But this argument, and where we get to the argument for belief in God, is just that, an argument for belief, not an argument for the existence of. But basically, it's a recognition that they can't present an argument for the existence of God, but they can try to present an argument to justify their belief. Hey, you can't demonstrate love. Yeah, we kind of can. Certainly we can demonstrate love under a number of different labels, far better than anybody's been able to demonstrate a God. But the argument is that if you can't, then I'm justified in believing this. If that's the sort of justification that you're after, is there anything you couldn't believe and just chalk it up to personal experience? Are we getting closer and closer to this idea of, well, it's true for me? Well, that's completely irrelevant as to whether or not it is in fact actually true that a God exists. Now, the conversation that I had with this young lady at Austin Peay was great, but I want to use this as an opportunity not only to talk about those two forms of an argument for belief, both from you can't see wind or you can't prove love, but also to talk about how the rest of this interaction went, because I'm hoping that this will be beneficial to other people as well. Try to remember to keep your audience in mind, and try to remember that there may be an audience you're unaware of. In a recent talk I gave at ReasonCon, I said some derogatory things about apologists. I don't mean these in a personal sense, that these individuals are somehow less significant or anything. I'm talking about the methodologies that apologists go through, and I'm happy to defend those right to the face of my apologist friends. But when I was engaging with this young lady, it was very clear that she, like many believers, had heard this argument from Wind. And it had resonated with her and her perhaps questioning that had gone on with regard to her belief in God. I can't really get into her mind and say, I don't know where she is in her walk with God. I don't know if she'll become an atheist. I don't know if she'll become a minister. I can't predict the future. But what I can, in fact, engage with people and try to keep them in mind. And so even though I know where she's going, as soon as she says, do you believe in wind? I'm happy to play along, because this lets her steer the conversation. I know that she's going to get to, yeah, well, you can't see it, but you can see its effects. And then we get to have a conversation about, first of all, how this is different and distinct from the God that she's arguing for, but how also the fact that you can have good reason for one thing that you can't merely see doesn't mean that you have good reason for other things that you can't also see. Because the things that don't exist are things that you cannot see. The conversation moved on and went into morality and talks about slavery. And at some point, it became clear that she was starting to realize that, like many believers, she had assumed something along the lines of, oh, well, this atheist has just never heard or thought about this particular line of reasoning. And when that failed, and it turned out I had heard and thought about that and had responses to what she was saying, then the next thing is she begins to doubt her own confidence levels and her belief and her reasons behind it. And when I followed this up with talk about slavery, she began to get a little upset, not panicky, not terrifying. Now, I can be an ass. I can be a nice guy. I don't tend to find that people are particularly intimidated by me. But I'm in this scenario, I'm not only a larger man, I'm the speaker that they invited to do this debate, and I'm now engaging one-on-one with someone younger and less informed on the topics, and who may have had issues at some point engaging in these conversations, I can in fact be imposing, and that's not my goal. And so when I recognize that she's having a bit of a troubling action, I stop, because I know that I've given her something to think about. I've already demolished her ideas of who I am and what I know, what I've thought about. I've demolished her initial argument. I have had a secondary argument about slavery where she was, tried everything. Oh, you're taking out of context. Okay, well, let's pull it up on the phone here and let's just read Exodus 21 together and you show me where I'm taking it out of context. Because if I'm wrong, and I am in fact taking this out of context, you should be able to show me that. And as that went on, it became clear that she was overwhelmed with the flood of information. I stopped. The goal is not to beat somebody into submission. The goal is to get people to think and think more clearly. And I went on and I had conversations with other people. And a friend of mine spoke to her at the back of the auditorium in a much different way, where they're just having a conversation. And I went up and spoke to her at the end and said, hey, I hope that I wasn't, overbearing or anything. My goal is not to beat people up or make them think they're stupid or anything else. It's to actually engage on the topics, to make people think, and to make me think. And that's the way that I hope that the world will change. So whether somebody comes up to you and says you can't prove wind, well, yeah, you kind of can. You can't prove love. Well, yeah, you kind of can. If you go along with what they're saying and they get to the point where, well, you can't see it, what difference does that make? There's countless things that I can't see with my eyes that are real. Meanwhile, what if there's someone who can't see at all? Does that mean that they can't have a good foundation to believe things? Of course they can. Because seeing something directly is not, in fact, the only way that we can explore and understand the universe. And when you prop up one idea that doesn't have justification by pointing out that one aspect in which it is missing justification is also missing elsewhere, and ignore all the other things, what attributes does this God have? Well, it can't be seen. Cool. Can it be experienced? When you say that you see the effects of God in the same way that you see the effects of wind, that's worth questioning. What effect have you seen, and how did you determine that it is attributable to a God? And how did you determine the other aspects of this God other than its apparent ability to do this? Because if I believed that the wind was a sentient being that not only moved leaves in ways that we could observe or caused tornadoes, but cared about who I was as a person and who I was having sex with, all of those other things need to be justified. And if the entire package is one where there can be no justification, or there's apparently not any justification, it doesn't matter how many other things you point to, or how many flaws in somebody else's reasoning. You're just waving red herrings around to make you feel better about believing something for which you don't have a good reason. We'll see you next time.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.